Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance group on Facebook and YouTube. I'm with Jennifer, and we're talking about her stay in Yemen. So I'm going to kind of set this up. You have left us with this beautiful environmental picture of Yemen and how friendly Yemen is. But I remember somewhere in my reading that you were a hostage in Yemen. So there is a big juxtaposition of saying everyone loves me and I'm really friendly with Yemen, and yet you're probably taken hostage. But I'm just teasing that out there so people will stay with us. But before I get to that, I want to understand, because I still haven't bridged your trip to Yemen, leaving the United States, going to Yemen to educate journalists there. You are obviously accomplished journalists at this point, and you went there on vacation for 3 weeks as a stint. I get a sense you've been there longer than 3 weeks, but I want to understand if you met your husband in Yemen.
I did meet my husband in
All
Yemen.
right, so why don't you just identify his name and then tell us a little bit about, I love the idea, I just watched on Netflix the Indian Matchmaker show. I don't know if you get Netflix in the UK. They just launched a new episode of season 2 of the Indian Matchmaker, where they have this matchmaker come from India over to the United States or into Mumbai, and she does the matchmaking. So matchmaking has always been, in part of my shtick, because I'm a consummate networker. So you might be thinking about, male or female. I just network with everyone.
Right.
I had 4,000 connections on Facebook, but that's funny. That's another story for another day. But but tell us a little bit how you met, how you networked with your husband, and how you eventually got married.
Okay, so I had been, because just to explain where I was by the time he arrived in Yemen. So by that time, so I hadn't come over on vacation. I'd come over to train journalists. And so I did that for 3 weeks. And then the man who owned the paper said, I want you to take over as editor-in-chief of this newspaper. And I then came back and ran the newspaper as editor-in-chief for a year. And that's what I was doing when I met my husband. So
did you have health care, and did you have a rent froze apartment?
No. So it's funny because when Ferris, who owned the paper, Fanis Sanabani, he offered me 12,000 a year to run the paper. And I said, I can't live on 12,000 a year. And he said, you can here. And he was absolutely right, because not only could I live on 12,000 a year, but I managed to save 5,000 of it while taking everyone I knew out to dinner every night. That Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. So it's really struggling right now too. There's massive famine and humanitarian crises. It was better when I was there, but still it's a very poor country. And it was impossible to spend money there when I was there. Yemenis are not materialistic. At least that's not my experience of them. They value family, tribe, religion, community, but they didn't have televisions unless they were the very few elite people who could afford such a thing. They didn't have internet in their homes, things like that. So I had originally turned down the offer, actually, to run the paper, because I just thought, this isn't realistic. I can't do this. But I went back to New York to my same old job, and I thought, I'd already been there for 5.5 years, and I thought, I don't want to keep coming to this gray carpeted office every single day and doing the same old thing. I need to shake up my life. And if moving to Yemen is going to shake up my life, then that's what I'm going to do. It wasn't in my plan. When I thought about living abroad, I thought about Paris and Rome, but
okay, I gotta stop you. So your parents see you in Seattle in a nice newspaper, comfortable. They don't have to go to sleep worrying about you and what's happening. So what do your parents think when they get the phone call that you are going to take a job where? Yemen. Okay, so let's hear that.
Right. So what they said was, we thought something like this might happen. That's a direct quote. They knew me pretty well by then, and always been a pretty independent kid. They didn't bother to try to talk me out of it because they knew that would be completely fruitless. But I mean, I was in New York City for September 11th, 2001.
Mhm.
So I wasn't really any safer in New York, I felt. So I went to Yemen and they came and visited me after I'd reassured them that it was safe. And you did point out the fact that anyway, let me explain about my husband first and then we'll get to the kidnapping. But so I'd been there for a year. I'd been running a newspaper, having the most interesting year of my life thus far. Training my journalists, learning a lot about Yemen, learning a lot about its history, and learning Arabic and all those sorts of things.
Now, were you on the international desk, or were you covering domestic Yemen, or what?
It's a Yemeni paper, so it was not international. It was a Yemeni paper. My whole staff was Yemeni.
So you're not covering Israel at all?
No, no. Not, I mean, there were some, I think we did have an international page where we put a couple of AP stories, but we didn't report them because no one in Yemen had, I mean, my boss wouldn't even give his own reporters notebooks and pens, which are the kind of the tools of the trade that you got to have. And he wouldn't help them out with their phone bills, which none of them could afford. My reporters were, they had no money. So, I often bought them dinner or bought them notebooks or pens or whatever because their boss, who drove a Mercedes, did not pay them very well. I mean, he probably paid them well compared to other jobs in Yemen, but they would run out of money before the end of the month,
Mhm.
pretty much every month. So, uh, but so after I'd been there for a year, but we covered the whole country, just to answer you. So, but mostly we were in Sana'a because there was no travel budget. So if we had to do reporting outside of Sana'a, we had to, talk to people who lived in other cities. I mean, I did manage to get around the country a lot sneakily in various ways. I traveled with my Arabic teacher. I traveled with a Jordanian friend, and it's all sorts of things. Um, but it was quite difficult to travel around Yemen at the time because you had to go through checkpoints and present passports, sometimes 17 times in a journey, just to get from one city to another. So in on July 14th, 2007, the French ambassador hosted a garden party to celebrate Bastille Day. And in the expatriate community in Yemen, this was a famous party. They had about 1,000 guests. They had alcohol, which was not available really anywhere else except for the British Club. So it was full of both foreigners and Yemenis. And the deputy British ambassador came over and said to me, the new British ambassador's here, let me introduce you to him. And I said, I have to meet a whole nother British ambassador. I'd known the previous British ambassador. He'd been really useful to me in my work because he'd introduced me to members of parliament who came to visit, and so I could interview them. And so he'd just helped me out a lot with finding stories for the paper. And I thought, I have to cultivate a whole nother source now. This is such a drag. And then I met Tim, who was standing in the middle of the French ambassador's garden in a pinstripe suit. And we started talking. And pretty early on in our
What were you
conversation,
wearing?
I was wearing a dark blue Indian tunic, so a cotton kind of embroidered, but all one color. Maybe it was
Mhm.
Turkish rather than Indian, but it was a long tunic, so it went down to my wrists and then to my knees, and I wore black trousers underneath. I do remember exactly what I was wearing.
I'm not surprised. I often ask this question because I do ask the question of how you meet your spouse, and I remember Jackie, who was with us in the last program, Jackie Gamache. She said, "My husband, when I first met him, I thought he was looking like Cary Grant."
Yeah.
So I'll ask you, what was your first impression?
I mean, I didn't think of him as looking like anyone other than himself, but I, by then I was already 38, I think, 38. And I I wasn't the kind of person who felt like I needed to be married. It wasn't a goal of mine. I thought, you know, I liked being in a committed relationship with someone. I wasn't against marriage, but I was pretty focused on work and what I wanted to do as a human on the planet. And I wasn't quite sure about having children yet. So I met Tim, and within a few minutes of our conversation, I thought, if I had to be married, I would want to be married to someone like him. And I don't know why that flashed through my mind. There was just
We call that beshert. Have you heard the term beshert?
no.
It's a Jewish term which is to be.
Ah, yeah. It just, I, yeah, we just had this, sparkly little conversation. One of those sparky conversations that's, I don't know, snappy and
He was
interesting.
born. He was born in the UK.
He grew up near Croydon, which is south of London. Um, and he was the oldest of six children. And he went to Oxford and he planned to become a primary school teacher. That was what he most wanted to do. And met someone whose father worked in the Foreign Office as, I think, a defense attaché. And Tim visited them and he thought, oh, this would be an interesting way to see the world. I could get a job in the Foreign Office. And I'll do that for a few years and then I'll be a primary school teacher. 40 years later, he's still working for the Foreign Office. So he's been with the Foreign Office for his entire career from the day he left Oxford.
So from the minute you saw him in the the pinstripe suit, how long was it until you decided to say yes?
Okay, so there is an unfortunate side to this story, but I don't want to lie to you. So I will tell you that he was married to someone else when we met.
Uh,
Um, and I realize that this doesn't put either of us in a good light, but I will say that that marriage would have ended with or without me. If but so it took a while for us to actually be together at all, because he wanted to extricate himself from his marriage, and then so
Mhm.
it was a year later that I moved in with him,
Mhm.
I think.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You didn't have to, but that's nice.
Yes, well, I just feel, I mean, that information is out there in the world. So I don't know. I just feel like life is messy. Relationships can be messy. Marriages can be messy. Things happen.
So you were married where?
We were married in Edinburgh at the Royal Scots Club in 2012.
So when does you bring Tim home to see your parents, or I assume?
Well, I didn't bring Tim home. I brought him to France, or he brought me to France, and my parents went to France, and we all met
Okay.
in France.
Okay.
And
So
my parents,
what was your parents' first impression of Tim?
oh, they loved him. I think they may love Tim more than they love me. Um, they think Tim's just the greatest thing to ever happen to me. Um,
So what was
and
it like? What was it like when you went to? Where did you meet Tim's family in the UK, or did they come to France too?
in the UK, so because it took a while for his divorce to be finalized, and because of my age, our daughter was 2.5 by the time we got married.
Mm.
Um, but I was pregnant when I met his family. Um, anyway, things have to happen fast when you're 39, it's just
No worries. You're not hearing of anything from me. I'm just
right.
curious what
Okay.
they thought. I'm just curious. I'm nosy that you haven't seen if you see a side profile, you'll see quite a long nose. I'm just curious.
Okay.
I'm just curious what his parents thought about you.
Well, unfortunately, his mother had already died
Uh,
at the age of 70, from a stroke. So that I was very sad that I never had the opportunity to meet his mother, who sounds like she was an incredible woman, and I would have dearly loved to know her. All six of her children loved and worshipped her. So, and they loved their father as well. And I did get to meet him, Sidney Torlot, who was incredibly kind and a wonderfully loving father. And unfortunately, he died not too long after his 80th birthday. So I think our daughter was around 2.5, maybe 3. I think she was 3 when her granddad died. So
Your
I did get
daughter,
to know him. Sorry.
your daughter has 6 uncles. Or is how many children?
All right. So
I'm not all uncles, right?
yeah. So Tim is the oldest. So there's 3 boys, 3 girls. So there's Tim, and he has 2 brothers, Nick and William, and 3 sisters, um, Joe, Kate, and Belinda. So
Are they close?
yeah, I think they are close. I mean, Tim probably less so than the others. His entire career has been based outside of the UK, which probably doesn't help. And then, um, I think people had, various issues with the way that his marriage ended and the relationship with me
Okay.
happened.
So
So,
I'm gonna steer. We teased the audience twice about your kidnapping. So I
right.
want to we'll get off of where we were and ask you. You are the ambassador's wife at some point, and are you in Yemen? Is he stationed in Yemen?
Yes, we were still in Yemen and we'd been there, but so when this happened, we'd been there 3.5 years. So I was completely comfortable in Yemen by then. Most of my friends were Yemeni. They came over to our house. I went to theirs. I
You're
walked.
still working at the paper?
No, I was by then writing my first book. I'd already sold it. So I sold my first book in
Which
2007.
which was what? Which one?
It's called The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, which is a line from a Yemeni poem. And that Yemeni poem is excerpted in the beginning of that book. The lines where that comes from is, she was a woman who fell from the sky in robes of dew and became a city. And it's about the city of Sana'a. And anyway, so my editor and I decided that made it a nice title. So in that book is a memoir, where you could find out probably too much about me. But that's just about 1 year of my life. It's only about the year spent running the Yemen Observer. So it's largely about my relationship with my reporters, how I trained them, how they trained me, because they taught me probably more than I taught them, and kind of the way that progressed.
And that was
And
your first writing attempt at a book.
that was my first book. Yes, it came out in 2010.
And so
Um,
how did the process, let's start there, because we're going to talk about your book in a little bit. But
okay.
I'm again teasing the audience to hang on about the hostage taking.
Oh, so you don't want me to answer that yet?
Not yet, because
Okay. All right.
we'll keep people online listening. So
Right. Okay.
so you go and decide to write a book. So what was the experience of you getting the box of published books delivered to you, I assume in Yemen? And what was the exhilaration like? Can you remember receiving that first box of published books?
This is going to sound crazy, but I don't particularly remember that with that book. I mean, what I remember is the day that I sold it on the basis of a proposal, because so I'd spent the whole time I was running the paper, I spent an hour every single morning before work. As soon as I got up, I wrote for an hour just about every single thing that happened. And then when I was at the news office, I kept a document open on my computer where I'd note down conversations that we had, things like that. I thought, and I wrote the book because I wanted people in the West to meet my Yemeni staff and to see them as human beings and not as terrorists. I wanted them to understand that these were people just like that, not just like them, but they were full humans that were funny and ambitious and challenging and all kinds of things like that we all are. And so that was my impetus for writing this particular book. I thought, I've had this amazing experience running this paper. I really want the rest of the world to see these people. I
So
want them to.
how did the world, first of all, you sold it to whom?
I sold it to Doubleday. Well, it was Broadway Books and Doubleday, both part of Penguin Random House. So, and we had several interested publishers, and Broadway Books and Doubleday were together at the time, but Broadway Books no longer exists as an imprint. My second book was with Doubleday as well, and the same editor, even though the first one says Broadway Books. It's a little confusing, but yeah, but they made a preemptive offer, which meant they offered me enough money that we didn't even see what other people would
Mhm.
which was for me, I mean, I thought I'd be lucky to get a very small press and get it published in, some dark corner of the world. And I've never had money. I'm not a person who's ever had money. I've never had a savings account. I've never been able to, because of the choices I've made, I'm taking full responsibility for this. I made choices that were not practical. I was a theater performer. I then went into $100,000 of debt going to grad school, and then I became a writer. So I didn't choose wealth. I chose things that were kind of guaranteed to deny me wealth. And so when I sold that first book, it was the first time in my life I ever had money, ever. And it was mine. I earned it.
Mhm.
And it was, the first time I went back to New York, I took everyone who'd ever helped me out to dinner at various times. And it was the first time in my life I'd ever been able to say, you know what? Let me pick up the check. I'll pick this up. And I loved it. I loved it. I loved picking up the check. It was the most exciting thing. I just thought, I want to give to these people. I want to do something for me. This is a small thing to do for the people who were so good to me for so long, but it just felt really good.
So who was the audience that really supported the book?
Well, actually, that's probably my best-selling book, to be honest. It got a really good review in the New York Times in 2010, and that was really exciting. And then after I met the managing editor at an event at the New York Times, he sent me a plaque of my first review in the New York Times. So I have it engraved on a plaque, and that was just the nicest thing.
Nice.
Um,
Very nice.
yeah, so my audience was, I mean, varied. There were, I suppose, a lot of anyone who'd ever been interested in the Middle East. A lot of military people read it, actually. People that had served in Yemen. A lot of people read it because they lived abroad and they could relate to the experiences of being in a foreign country, that they felt challenged them. A lot of Americans read it. I did a book tour when my daughter was 6 months old. She came with me.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, that
and
was exciting. So we have a lot of would-be authors, and we have published authors in the group, as you know. Um, what was the experience of learning? Because this was your first chance to really to make mistakes. And what would you recommend? Knowing what you know now, what would you tell someone who came to you, and said, "Hey, I want to write my book."
I would ask them some questions first, what their goals are for the book. But the most important thing is to write, is just to not talk about it. I'd say stop talking about it and go sit down and write. But here's one thing that has been really useful to me is if you wait to have 3 hours of free time to work on your book, you're never going to write it. At least this is my experience, at least with being female in the world. There's always something else demanding your attention. But if you have, let's say you just have 20 minutes before work in the morning, if you write for 20 minutes every single morning, it accretes, it adds up. And so I think you need to just say, it's worth writing, even if I only have 20 minutes today. These tiny little moments, you just have to grab them when you can. I mean, I wrote during my daughter's naps. I wrote before my family woke up. I wrote, and I feel like women struggle with this a lot more than men, because the male writers I know, they just, write their book and leave everything to their wives. But husbands are less willing to totally pick up 100% of the slack. And so female writers are often juggling a lot of other things. Even if they don't have kids, housework, cooking, anything. And so you kind of have to, if you're having trouble working at home, you need to go out of the home and work in a coffee shop so that you aren't tempted to do laundry, to procrastinate.
So is your process of what you started with, and you can tell us a little bit about the process of your first book, did it change, morph into a process for Exile Music, which is your latest book?
Oh, yeah, it changed dramatically. I mean, first of all, my first book was memoir, meaning every single word of it is true to the best of my ability. I researched the heck out of that book, and it was my own experience based on my
And how much
journals.
research time did you put into that book, your first book?
2 years after spent the year running the paper. So there, if you count that, probably 3 years.
Now, are you doing, while you're researching, you're also doing that writing on the way? So it's not do
Yeah.
solid research up front. You're doing a hybrid of research, writing, and then more research and maybe more writing or so on.
That's correct. I have to do it at the same time because, for example, when I was writing Exile music, which is set partly in Austria and partly in Bolivia, in 1938 through the 50s. So I had this time period I haven't lived through to investigate, but I also had two completely different cultures and continents to research. But if I were to say start with researching the Holocaust in Austria, I would be researching for the rest of my natural lifetime. There's so much information, there's so much documentation. So, what I needed to know was, what do I need to know for the purposes of the story I'm telling? What's critical for, so I had to be writing it so I knew what I needed to know.
So
Like I
when
would
did you,
get,
sorry, when do you determine what is the story you're telling?
that is a very good question and a tough one to answer. I am not, I hear of writers such as John Irving, for example, who they plot out everything. They have to know the last word of the novel before they start. They write outlines. I am the opposite of this. So what I do is I can't just sit here and think of a plot. I start writing and plots come. And I don't, it feels, I'm not a mystical person, but it feels a little bit like that. Everything comes to me in the act of writing. And my first draft is about figuring out what the plot is, figuring out what the story is. And it just comes to me as I go. And like with The Ambassador's Wife, for example, I wrote it in little quilt pieces. And so they're little squares of text. And then I shuffled them. Maybe I should have said playing cards. And then I shuffled them and put them in different orders. But I would write little scenes and then figure out what scene do I need to add to have this make sense. But with
So
Exile music,
where did that come from? That process come from the first process, which was different than what you've just described. And then what was
yeah.
the process of Exile music?
So in a way, Exile music was a little more like the memoir, but with more research. So my first book is linear because it's 1 year of my life. It starts in August, it ends a year later. But it's not organized purely in terms of time. But anyway, but it has a very straightforward structure. The
And this
Ambassador's
book,
Wife,
I want to give the audience a chance to buy your book. So what is that book called?
the first one is called The Woman Who Fell from the Sky.
The second one?
The second one is called The Ambassador's Wife.
And the third one is
And
Exile Music. So
it's
anybody who
Exile
is
Music.
listening will hopefully go on Amazon. They're all available on Amazon, and you can find them there. So go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that I'm happy to be interrupted. So The Ambassador's Wife, I was just figuring out how to write a novel because The Ambassador's Wife was my first real novel. I'd written a novel before, but not a publishable one. So this is my first kind of big book. And so I was figuring out how to create plot and structure. And then with Exile Music, I was much more comfortable because it was my second novel, but it was also completely different. It was historical and needed a ton more research. And there is not a single autobiographical element in Exile Music. I mean, it's people whose experience is nothing like mine. And so I had to research practically every word of that book.
So
And
how much research time did you put in?
so Exile Music took me about 5 years of research. And that only includes the last year I was in Bolivia, which is when I started working on it. But I'd already lived in Bolivia for 3 years. So you could add another 3 years of just living in Bolivia and learning about it and learning about the history of the Jewish community in Bolivia.
So, I'm an impatient person. I think you already have gathered that. But how do you stay with the topic for, you said it was going to be 6 years plus another 3 years. That's 9 years of your life. And then, how do you contain it? For me, I have like a fire hose of pollution that has to just come out. I can't contain my emotions. I'm very creative in that respect. I have to get them out of me. And even if I call it getting in the game, even if it's like, pure trash, it's at least out of me and it's not sort of churning in my head. So how do you manage a project that's with you in your DNA, in your gut, in your brain, in your blood for 6 years, plus maybe 9 years?
Well, I suppose one answer is you create characters you want to hang out with. I love, I mean, this family and Exile Music, they
All
are
right,
real
so
to
let's help. Let's tell
me.
the audience who the family is.
Okay, so my protagonist is a girl. She's 10 when the book starts. Um, and her name is Orly, and her father's name is Jacob, and her mother's name is Julia. And she has a brother named Willie, and they are a Jewish family living in Vienna. And Julia, the mother, is an opera singer. The father is a viola player with the Vienna Philharmonic. And Orly grows up around music, not just the classical music of her parents, but the popular music of the times, which is another thing. I mean, a lot of my research was enjoyable. I had to interview. I found this great pianist who plays with the Max Raab Orchestra that play only music from the 1920s. So I thought this is great, and a lot of it's popular music. And so that's the kind of stuff Orly would have been singing on the streets as she with her friends, or might have heard on the radio.
Does Orly have a relationship to your daughter?
Actually, yes. Especially in the way, I decided to tell the story. She doesn't stay a child for the whole book. She's probably in her 40s, I think, at the end of the book. But when my daughter was around 3 or 4 and we were in Bolivia, we were standing in the kitchen and I was making quinoa porridge. I don't remember what I was wearing, but I do remember I was making quinoa porridge. And she said,
What is chemo porridge?
quinoa is a grain.
Quinoa. Oh, quinoa.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I
Sorry.
heard I heard chemo. Chemo. I was like, whoa.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, we ate quinoa every day in Bolivia. So,
All right.
um,
I want to stop you on quinoa, because we've just finished our second 30 minutes of time, and we haven't talked about, and we're
the
told the
kidnapping.
audience the kidnapping. So we're gonna make sure that I'm not making any promises, but I think we will get back to the kidnapping on episode 3. So thank you for staying with us. We're having a really fun time of discussion here on the Obligations of Memory podcast with Jennifer Steil, and her latest book is Exile Music. We'll come right back and we'll continue where we left off. And I promise you, we will, by the end of our discussion, talk about how you're kidnapping. And obviously, you're still with us, so it's a good ending.
Yeah. Yeah.